Welcome to What Matters Now, the Times of Israel's weekly podcast, drilling into one issue affecting Israel and the Jewish world right now. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with author and scholar Dara Horn. Dara, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Where am I finding you today?
In New Jersey.
New Jersey, definitely heard of that. And we are here to talk about your newest book, which is One Little Goat. But most people will have heard of your earlier books, including the nonfiction work People Love Dead Jews, and several novels, including Eternal Life, A Guide for the Perplexed, and many others. I have read actually a surprising number of your corpus, but not one of the books we're going to discuss in the second half of the program, People Love Dead Jews. So One Little Goat is Dara's first work for young readers, which is really exciting. I read it all in one sitting because I know my ABCs last night, and we are going to talk about all things goat and scapegoat after this.
I like what I do as a Jew, and I find it interesting and meaningful, but I want to learn about what's out there and how do the rest of our people connect.
You come in knowing some things, but nobody here knows everything, because everyone has had like puzzle pieces, and together we kind of make up this whole larger puzzle.
I think the Hartman Fellowship has impacted me as a Jewish leader more than any other Jewish program that I've done, because it sort of broadened my horizon on what exactly it means to be a Jewish teen and what sort of Jewish teen learning looks like.
So Dara, thank you again for joining me. And I read your book, as I said, One Little Goat last night. Let me just show it for the people. And it's just a fascinating storyline. I'm going to read out what's actually on your website. And One Little Goat is a quirky, dryly funny, Passover-themed graphic novel featuring a lost matzah, a never-ending seder, and a time-traveling talking goat. Obviously, right?
Of course.
So I have to say that the combination of the really crazy story and the drawings just made me wonder if you had some kind of bad mushrooms before writing this book, because it is so trippy. How did you come up with this idea?
Oh, gosh. Well, so this book is actually it's an idea I've been thinking about since I was a child, actually, which I can say more about that. I've always been fascinated by how the Seder is kind of a portal to the past. And there's this fascination with portal fiction, which I'll call it for young adult readers, right? A lot of children's literature is based on this idea that there's some kind of magical entrance to a world that's bigger than yours, right? Like,
Sure, Narnia, for example.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Or, there's the train platform that takes you to Hogwarts, or, the tornado that takes you to the Land of Oz, whatever it is, right? This is a very common thing in children's literature. And since I was a child, I've had this idea of Passover being this journey to the past. I can say a little bit about how I came to that idea. This book kind of grows out of two seders that I attended growing up. One was my parents' seder, where I'm one of four children, and my parents always thought it was very important for us to feel very invested in the Passover story. And the way they did this was having us, assigning us all to create songs and skits and little plays that we would put on during the Seder, acting out the Pesach story and different aspects of the Seder. And that made me feel really invested in the story. We also used to attend another Seder when I was growing up that was not not relatives of ours, friends of ours. Because of course here in the Diaspora we have two seders. So
I know, it's such a good reason to make Aliyah. I'm telling you.
Well, but what it does allow you to do is experience other families and what they, there's you get to sort of see what other people are doing. There's a little more leeway. And the second Seder we used to go to, family friends of ours, where it was this giant multi-generational gathering. It was like 40 or 50 people seated at this incredibly long table, and they used to seat us by age. So old people were on one end of the table and the children were way on the other end. And I'm 47, so this was in the 80s and 90s when I would attend these seders. And at that time, the old people were Holocaust survivors, some of whom had participated in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which happened on Pesach of 1943. That was like the old people, and they were like, singing songs in Yiddish, which I didn't know at the time, and now I do. The middle of the table, there were a couple people there my parents' age who were from the former Soviet Union, who were refuseniks, and they were very active in the cause for liberation of Soviet Jews. That was what their seder was about. And then like way on the end were the kids who were talking about TV shows or whatever. And I just remember feeling like, as a child, like there are 3 different seders happening at this seder, and thinking, well, some of the other seders might be more interesting than mine, but also sort of having this vision where, without any trippy drugs, but, just having this vision as a child that this room that I was sitting in was like this lighted box that was at the top of a tower of lighted boxes, all of which were rooms in which previous seders had taken place. And that every seder that we attend is that, right? We're all sitting in this room that's sitting on top of this tower of rooms, going all the way down to the first seder, which was prior to the Exodus from Egypt. And so I had this idea for a long time. I could say a little bit more just about the mechanics of this book, which you started to mention. So One Little Goat is like a dramatization of this idea. It's about a family that's at their seder, and I love how for this podcast I don't have to explain the mechanics of this. They can't find their afikomen. I go on other podcasts that aren't Jewish podcasts. I have to like take a few minutes to explain what that is.
Well, not all of our audience actually is Jewish, and so just one sentence.
Well, I am used to explaining this, and it is explained in the book. The afikomen is this piece of matzah that is required to end the meal, and so there's sort of games that we play with it where children hide it, adults hide it, people hold it for ransom because it can't. The seder meal cannot end without it. In this instance, in this family, no one can find the afikomen. They later figure out the reason, which is that the toddler who can't talk has thrown it through a hole in the space-time continuum.
Obviously, of course.
Yeah, of course. No one can find this afikomen, so as a result, the seder cannot end, and they're trapped at the seder for 6 months. And the food's regenerating on the table, people's hair is growing long, the pregnancies are progressing. 6 months in, there's a knock on the door, and the oldest child in the family goes to answer the door, and it's a talking goat. And this goat tells him that, he's the scapegoat, he's the reason for everyone's problems. And he says, I can help you find your afikomen. And the child says, great, where is it? And the goat says, no, not where, when? And the goat then explains that while they have been trapped at this never-ending seder, thousands of years of previous seders have accumulated underneath their seder. And they now have to travel down into those thousands of years of previous seders in order to find their afikomen and bring their seder to its end. So it's a very trippy idea, but I think it's really actually built into Jewish tradition. This sort of, this sense of time travel is part of the seder experience.
100%. We're all meant to imagine ourselves going through the experience of course, the Exodus from Egypt, but it's just also built up, and you touch on this, of course, in the framing of your story. There's the 4 questions, the 4, sons, or could be daughters, right? And of course, the wise guy of the story is the one who learns the most in One Little Goat. And I just really loved that idea as well. It was really fascinating to me to read it as a parent as well. And I know you have children too. And I read it alone. I will read it to my children who can't read. But I wonder what your kids think about it.
Well, so yes, I have. I'm one of 4 children. I have 4 children. So that passage about Arba Banim, about the 4 sons or the 4 children in the Haggadah in the Passover Seder has always been, always felt a little too personal with these 4 different personalities. This book actually came about because of my children, purely for logistical reasons. The reason I decided to embark on this genre because I had, as I mentioned, I had this idea kicking around in my head for many, many years since I was a child. And a few years ago, we were on a road trip in California, and we had stopped at a comic book shop. And all four of my children fascinated by comics, graphic novels, manga, these anime, whatever, all that stuff. They're really into that stuff. And so they came out of this store with like armloads of books, which I was totally delighted by because we're going to be in the car for hours and hours. And there's this one particular book that they start fighting over in the car. And it's this real thick graphic novel by this cartoonist, Theo Ellsworth, who I had never heard of. And they're just fighting over it. Like, no one could get enough of this book. And I'm like, what is this book? And I borrowed it from them at some point later on this trip. And I was just enchanted by this person's artwork. He's this like underground comics kind of style. He's like he's quite acclaimed indie cartoonist. And he just had this like, his style is this like very like, intricate pen and ink work. It's like a little bit subversive, a little bit, unexpected. And he has this knack for making abstract ideas literal. So it's the kind of thing where I remember one panel in that book where it says, I'm walking around with a yelling brain, and it has this man whose head is unzipped, and there's another man coming out of his head screaming, and screaming his head off, and then that person's brain is unzipped. It's like that kind of thing. And I was just enchanted by this. And I'd had this idea for such a long time about these, stack of satyrs. And I looked at I looked him up online, didn't know much about him. His name is Theo Ellsworth. He lives in Montana. I'm thinking, yeah, he's probably not Jewish. I was correct about that. I just cold emailed this guy and was like, I love your work. I'm a writer. I have an idea for a book. Deep breath. It's going to take some time to even explain what this idea is. And he was just totally game. He's an absolute delight to work with. There's so many things in this book that came from him. We could talk about that. But in terms of my children, I mean, yeah, my children really introduced, I'm not a comics reader at all. This is not my genre. This is not something I know anything about, but my children are obsessed with it. And yeah, I wrote this thinking of like something that, what would they enjoy? And, there's something about the way this is not like a cute book. Do you know what I'm saying? Like there's
I
nothing
do. I have to say,
talking down to the reader. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not cute. And in fact, just to comment on Theo Ellsworth's style, we're kind of the same age, you and I. I'm almost 50. And it really reminded me of those zines. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Those zines that were passed around in high school, just photocopied sheets of, underground comics. And he really captured that. So it's not like cute in any kind of way. It's kind of grungy in many ways.
Yes.
And you said he was making the abstract literal. I would say also the opposite, that he made literal very abstract as well, which is just a fascinating push-pull in terms of his artwork. So yeah, please continue.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think it's that was what attracted to me about his work. And that's what I think he did so beautifully here, because you can imagine how a different illustrator might have done this in like made it more cute, right? Like, oh, here's your animal sidekick, right? But like the goat here, there's this kind of like stoic integrity to this character of the goat. And this is something this character of the goat is something I thought about a lot too, because my academic work is in, history of Hebrew and Yiddish literature. And so, look, the idea of the scapegoat is from a different Jewish holiday, right? It's from Yom Kippur. It's from this, ceremony that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would do in the ancient temple, and prior to that in the portable, in the Mishkan, in the portable temple in the wilderness. This idea of the goat you put the sins of the people onto its head. Of course, it also appears in the Pesach liturgy at the end of the Seder in the song Chag Gadya, right? Which, this goat that my father bought for 2 zuzim, then the cat that ate the goat, and all those animals. And I just, and it's something that recurs a lot in Hebrew and Yiddish literature. There's a lot of sort of famous stories by these canonical Hebrew and Yiddish writers like Shai Agnon. Story Maaseh Ha'ez, the fable of the goat, was actually the first story I ever read in Hebrew. When I was learning Hebrew as a teenager. And I just was, and there's a lot of Yiddish story. My work is in Yiddish literature. There's a lot of Yiddish stories involving goats. Sort of this like integrity to this animal, where it's like this quiet fatalism, where, there's this sort of running joke in the book where, every time something terrible happens, they say to the goat, "This is all your fault." And he's like, "I know." He's like, "Of course it's my fault. Everything's always my fault." It's like actually this kind of like dry and subversive idea of like traveling through history with this, goat who accepts that everything's his fault. It's just like, I don't know. I felt like I wanted to, that was one way that my children's interests inspired me, and that I had this like front row seat to seeing that like, children are interested in that, in, this intellectual honesty. Right. And they're not, this, at least my children, like, we're not interested in this like cute and cuddly, Disney kind of approach. And also it's not appropriate to Jewish history to take that approach. There's a lot of darkness to this story. I mean, the story of Passover is actually really scary. And we could talk about that. And that's actually quite very much reflected in the book.
It is. It's reflected in the content of the book, and it's also reflected, of course, in the drawing. So, as we said, and you can see, really frightening stuff. I wouldn't necessarily show it to my 3.5-year-old, but definitely I think the 12-year-old is going to be way on board with this. And I do want to pivot the conversation because our time is relatively short and talk about a different kind of scapegoat, and that is the Jews. So, when you were writing this book, just to tie it all together, were you considering the idea of the Jew as the eternal scapegoat as well, or was that not really part of your thinking here?
Well, that's part of the joke, right? I mean, is that it becomes this journey through Jewish history, and it does go into these dark moments in Jewish history. So that is, so it's not a coincidence that he's being led through by the scapegoat, and also that is, there's a lot of interpretations of Chad Gadya and its origins, the song at the end of the Seder. What I find the most compelling interpretation, just and not necessarily historical, but most interesting, is the idea of the Chad Gadya, that the goat in that song represents the Jewish people, that my father bought for 2 zuzim, that the father is God, and the 2 zuzim are the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments, and then that the cat who ate the goat, and then the dog that bit the cat, and all these other, animals and entities in the song are these empires that have conquered the Jewish people.
Oh, that's really fascinating. I've never heard that interpretation.
Oh,
I
no?
always kind of
Yeah, it's
thought
like
of
the
it.
cat is the
Yeah.
Babylonians, and then the dog is the Persians, and then, you have all these other, Greek and Roman and Christian and Islamic empires, and I think the end is supposed to be the Crusaders, because that's the origins of the song is in the Middle Ages. So yeah, and then God kills the angel of death. So it's this idea that there's always going to be, this return, and then the song keeps coming back to the goat. Yeah, so that's absolutely the metaphor I'm looking at. I also thought about this, when I say Passover is really scary. I started writing this book several years, actually, even before my last book, People of Dead Jews, came out. I started writing this book in 2020 and 2021. And then, there's boring publishing reasons why we didn't finish it until now. But we were finishing the book after October 7th of last year. And the illustrator, I'd written the whole text before, but the illustrator is, the cartoonist, he's working on it, and it's a lot of back and forth. And I remember when he got to the part at the end of the book, so this, he goes through this journey through Jewish history. He meets members of his family, and he sees their experiences. And a lot of them are this kind of, darker moments. So like he goes to his father's Seder in, pre-Glasnost Soviet Union, where his Seder consists of his mother getting a piece of matzah from a secret bakery and being like, "Tonight's the night, here we are," and that's it. He goes to his great grandmother's Seder in the Warsaw Ghetto. So you do have these like moments. He goes to a medieval Seder, early modern Seder that's Doña Gracia Nasi, who set up this underground railroad to bring Jews out of Inquisition Spain. So he sort of sees these more moments and other less dire situations as well. I mean, it's not all of it is that. But at the very end of the book, he has to go back to the original Seder, which is actually the night before the Exodus from Egypt. Because, we think of the Seder as celebrating the Exodus, but the first Seder is actually the night before the Exodus. It's when, in the Torah, where God tells the people of Israel to kill this lamb. They have to sacrifice this lamb, the Korban Pesach, the Passover sacrifice, put its blood on the doors of their home, And then they eat this lamb, they eat the meat of this lamb, they eat the matzah, yes, before the Exodus. So it's not just about not having time for your bread to rise. They eat the matzah, and then they also eat bitter herbs. And they're supposed to, and this is called Leil Shimurim, the night of watching, or the night of vigil, right? While they're waiting for the angel of death to pass over their homes, right? This is the final of the Eser Makot, of the 10 plagues. And when he drew this, he told me, and this is again after October 7th, he said, I'm going to draw this. It's going to be a different feel from the rest of the book. Everything's going to be completely in shadow. And, there's going to be, everything's going to be very thickly cross-hatched, and it's going to have a completely different vibe from the rest of the book. And it does. And I will spoil this aspect of the book for readers a little bit, because by the time you read it, you get to this part, you won't remember. But he goes into this one house in ancient Egypt, and the goat tells him this is the one, and he opens the door, and it's his family, and they say, "Where have you been? We've been waiting for you," right? Because this is the moment where he's where it says in the Haggadah, you see yourself as if you personally came out of Egypt. We're drawing this and writing this after, just very shortly after October 7th was when we were, first, he's sending me the very first illustrations of these pages. I cannot look at that part of the book anymore without thinking of a mamad, right? Of these, shelters and safe rooms that people in Israel were, of course, spending their time in during the attack of October 7th, and of course are frequently going back to during all these many, many missile attacks. That experience of being in this room, close the door, and waiting out the angel of death. And it made me think differently about all of the other seders in the book, this whole tower of seders. I sort of realized there's this, this is a children's book. And I think it's interesting that this tradition brings children into that story. And, as you say, like, it's something like, it's not a story that's appropriate for children. And yet the entire Pesach, the entire experience of the Seder is about centering children in that experience. And that's because the ultimate message of Pesach is not about this litany of horror, but about this amazing resilience in the face of this horror. And this sort of gift that this story has given us about hope in this moment of horror. And it's very much changed the way I think about, the way I think about Pesach, and the way I think about this. This was an experience I had in creating this book with this artist.
I think that children in the past ages, the other ages that your wise child visits, were less precious, meaning they were, of course, loved by their parents, obviously, but they were less sheltered, and they were more aware of the horrors that take place every single day. And, of course, in Israel, we are more aware than I think U.S. kids are in general, but it's quite possible that October 7th made other diaspora Jews realize the existential threat and horrors that Jews are still living under. It's not just a story, it's something that's happening every single day. Of course, obviously, mostly right now to the hostages who are still in Gaza. They're experiencing the 10 plagues every single day, all of them, all at once. And it's quite possible that it's appropriate, actually, to introduce the children to the full scope of humanity and lack thereof through these stories and through children's literature. I mean, think about the Grimm brothers. Obviously, their tales were, grim. And throughout the ages, until probably quite recently, children actually were exposed to the horrors and the terribleness of humanity through children's literature. I want to turn our conversation a little bit to your past work as well. And I told you in an email that I have not read your so acclaimed book. I want to turn our conversation a little bit to your past work as well. And I told you in an email that I have not read your so acclaimed book. And I want to turn our conversation a little bit to your past work as well. And I told you in an email that I have not read your so acclaimed book. And I want to turn our conversation a little bit to your past work as well. And I told you in an email that I have not read your so acclaimed book. And I want to turn our conversation a little bit to your past work as well. And I told you in an email that I have not read your so acclaimed book. And I want to turn our conversation a little bit to your past work as well. And I told you in an email that I have not read your so acclaimed book. And I want to turn our conversation a little bit to your past work as well. And I told you in an email that I have not read your so acclaimed book. And I want to turn our conversation a little bit to your past work as well. And I told you in an email that I have not read your so acclaimed book. And I want to turn our conversation a little bit to your past work as well. And I told you in an email But on the way into the office, I listened to your first episode of your podcast, Adventures with Dead Jews. Why do people love dead Jews? That's the subtitle. And I found it so interesting to get a little bit of a window into what you were thinking or before you wrote the book and perhaps while you were writing the book. And because you already brought up the idea of October 7th, I just have to wonder, and I'm sure you've been asked this gazillion million times since October 7th, can you apply the lessons that you learned in researching and writing this book into perhaps a new sequel, Why People Love Dead Israelis? Are you thinking that at this point?
I mean, I'm more than thinking it. So this has been the only thing I've been thinking and doing in the past year and a half. So People Love Dead Jews. This book came out in late 2021. And its premise is basically that non-Jewish societies only respect Jews when Jews have no power, whether that means they're politically impotent or dead. So I wrote this book really as this is an intellectual exploration. It was sort of a phenomenon that I noticed in my scholarship and my journalism. The book travels around the world. It looks at things like Holocaust education and memorialization. It looks at things like Jewish heritage sites in places as far away as China. It looks at Jewish historical experiences and looks at contemporary Jewish life in the United States. I was writing this after a number of violent attacks against Jewish communities in the United States. I really thought of this as like an intellectual exercise. Like I was sort of just, this is like a problem I've noticed in my research and in my writing, and I just sort of want to dive into this problem. After I wrote that book, it was like this like floodgates opened where like I felt like every Jew on the planet is coming to me with their horror stories. And this is before October 7th that was happening to me. After October 7th, this became like institutionalized, where then institutions start coming to me with these problems. And so the most obvious example of that is that I got dragged into this anti-Semitism advisory group to the now former president of Harvard, who did not take our committee's advice. And, in fact, it went so incredibly badly that I was then called into Congress to be a witness in the congressional investigation of these universities. That's one of many, many ways in which I've been involved in this. It's very obvious to me that the experiences of Israel and diaspora Jews are completely intertwined. There's no disentangling them. So what has happened to me? So because I happen to have written this book prior to October 7th, it's like I suddenly became this like, central address for people to like dump their horror stories and for people to sort of just come to me with all of their, crises. Because people would write to me being like, can you help? Like this, Harvard thing. I mean, there was a lot of other examples I could give. People in a lot of different sectors like asking me for help and advice with this. And so I wrote that book. It was like, I was a little bit stupid. Like I didn't understand that when you write it, it was my first nonfiction book. I have 5 novels I wrote before that. When you write a nonfiction book, people expect about a problem. People expect you to solve the problem at the end of the book. And so then I had all these people asking me, I was like, what's your solution to this problem? And I'm like, did you really want me to give you the final solution to the Jewish question? Because I'm really not prepared to give that to you. I've now been thinking about this much more seriously, and it's become obvious to me that there are ways to address this problem in the diaspora. So to me, this is like, there's a couple of different things going on here, right? There's the current war that Israel is facing on multiple fronts, right? This is a political and a military problem. And the situation with the hostages, right? The situation with all of, with the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? I mean, it's like, these are like, gigantic, geopolitical crises. In the diaspora, at least in the United States, there's a different problem which became clear to me traveling around the United States talking about this book. Because what I found was I was speaking in many, many different audiences, usually for non-Jewish audiences. And I just discovered that there's just so much more ignorance than malice. And it would often happen to me that I'd be speaking at these, college campus or something, and there'd be like, these very ignorant people who would, ask these hostile questions and, whatever they're wearing, their keffiyeh or something while they're asking me. And I would just answer these questions. And instead of like heckling me back, they'd be like, wow, I never thought of it that way before. And it sort of just became more and more clear like that. And then people would come to me afterwards, say like, do you have, this was really interesting what you said. Do you have like a reading list to give me? Can you come speak to my school district about this? Right? Can you give me a lesson plan for this? And I was like, no, because I'm me. Right? Like I'm just, I don't have like a staff, right? I'm literally a writer whose next book is about a talking goat, right? Like I can't be the person to solve this problem. But then it just happens so often that I was like, I can't not address this. So a couple of things happened. Number one, I am working on another nonfiction book that is about, it is in fact called The Final Solution to the Jewish Question, because I love obnoxious titles. And the subtitle is A Love Story for the Living. And it is about, it's about how to address this larger problem of ignorance. Because what I found is traveling around the United States, we have a lot of states in the United States where there's laws mandating that children in public schools learn about the Holocaust. And I want to be really clear, like I'm not arguing that against Holocaust education. It's, that is not my argument. But what I noticed is that there's not a single place in this country where anyone is required to learn who are Jews.
Like I and my wife, like we were mourning with people. But because of the way that things have changed, let's say in the last 5 to 7 years, there was a feeling that, and this is the substance of an exchange I had in Dissent with another member of the magazine's editorial board, the kind of progressive movement, I think a lot of people in the progressive movement felt, well, if we make a big deal out of Jewish pain and suffering in the wake of October 7th, it'll be instrumentalized and used to justify the war. That's like a generous interpretation. And my argument was actually not mourning legitimates the war. And this is because people don't understand also how like Israelis feel themselves to be in the world. That if you were able to mourn, then you also might be able to say to people, look, like this, what happened is heinous and horrible. And there is another way other than living by the sword forever. But when the world's response to this is you got what you deserved, and this is even a good thing, well, you only confirm the sentence that the whole world is against us.
So you have this situation where children in non-Jewish children in public schools are required to learn that Jews are people who died in Europe between 1933 and 1945. And that is the only thing they know about Jews, to the extent where I was at the Dallas Holocaust Museum for a teacher conference, and the docents told me that students who come through the museum will ask the docents, are there still Jews alive today? Because if you came to this museum, you wouldn't know. And what that means is that we've outsourced the task of teaching people who are Jews to TikTok. And, this sort of deliberate avoidance of talking about Israel in American education, that has been completely outsourced to TikTok. And then it's like there's Jewish organizations that are sort of trying to address this, and they're addressing it in this defensive posture where it's like, everything about the way you're presenting it is presented through this non-Jewish frame of like, well, how do Jews fit into like American ideas about identity? It's like, oh, are Jews a religion, or Jews a race, or Jews a nationality? It's like, well, this actually isn't complicated. It's just old. Jews predate all of those categories that you mentioned, right? Like Jews predate the concept of race. Jews predate the concept of religion, right? I mean, there wasn't, Eliezer Ben Yehuda had to like dig through the Gemara to find word that meant religion, right? Like the word we have now, dot, is like, that was like a word that, I don't know if it was Ben Yehuda or other linguists, like they kind of picked that word out of, I don't know, the Mishnah or the Gemara to like mean religion because they needed a word for that. But like, ancient Hebrew didn't really have a word for that because it wasn't really a concept, right? I mean, it's like, there's an answer to who Jews are. Jews are a joinable tribal group with a shared history, homeland, and culture. That was a sentence in English. In Hebrew, it is one word that is 2 letters long. We're Am Yisrael. And it's like, if you don't explain that category to people, they have no ability to understand anything else in the entire history of the Jewish people. Like, nothing else makes sense if you don't understand that category. And then the other piece is understanding anti-Semitism. You know, often the way it's explained is like the scapegoat explanation, right? Like, oh, it's, you know, Jews are an easy target. They're, you know, because in all these countries in the diaspora, they're a minority and, you know, people resent them or something like that. I actually don't, I think it's deeper than that. I think there actually is a complete intertwining between the history of the Jewish people and anti-Semitism, because, and I don't think you can understand one without the other, because, and I think it goes back to the Passover story, because of course the foundational concept of Am Yisrael, of the people of Israel, is monotheism, belief in one God, rejection of idolatry. And today we say those things and it sounds like religion, right? We think of that as like a spiritual idea. In the ancient Near East, that's a political idea. And you see it dramatized in the Passover story, because in other societies in ancient Near East, like ancient Egypt, they've got lots of gods, and one of the gods is the dictator. Right? The Pharaoh is considered one of the gods. Like the whole book, you know, the whole story of the Exodus is like this showdown between the God of Israel and the Egyptian gods, specifically, you know, and especially the Pharaoh. So when the Jews in ancient times said that they don't bow to other gods, what they actually were saying is that they don't bow to tyrants. This is an anti-tyrannical movement since ancient times. And I, you know, unfortunately, like all movements, does not always live up to this ideal, you know, whether in ancient or in modern times, right? But this is an ancient anti-tyrannical movement. An anti-tyrannical movement is always going to piss off tyrants. You know, this is a non-conforming counterculture. A non-conforming counterculture is always going to piss off people in a dominant culture who need to be validated by everyone agreeing with them. So I have actually now building this out into educational modules that I'm using, that we're implementing in public schools that we've already started. I've already done trainings with teachers from a number of public school districts in the United States. So if your listeners are interested in this, we're called Mosaic Persuasion. We don't even have a website yet, but they can contact me through my website. So if anyone's an educator in the United States who's interested in being involved, I'd love to be in touch.
Okay, I love all your passion, number one, obviously, and also this idea of Jews as the counterculture anti-tyrants. But, okay, I have to wonder, I mean, all of that is in very American terms, shall we say, in terms of...
Yes, of course.
Right, how Americans view Judaism and the role of Judaism and the point of Judaism and the Jewish people in general. I'm Israeli. I moved here in 1999, so I pretty much wiped out all of my North American sensibilities by now. And I wonder, especially having listened to your podcast earlier, whether the Jews of America and the Jews of Israel still have that common language. Obviously, we still consider ourselves as the Am, the people. You know, we are all one people. But I don't know if that's the goal of Israelis right now, to be this anti-tyrannical movement. Obviously, everyone knows what's going on the streets of Israel right now. There are protests against the potential crumbling of democracy. But I don't know if that's the heart of the Israeli ideal of what is a Jew at this point. And I just wonder if we've become so split as a people that teaching this about Jews to the general public, is that really accurate at this point?
Yes. I think this is so ingrained in us as Jews that sometimes we don't even see it. In Israel, you're surrounded by tyrannical regimes, right? And obviously, there's an enormous fraying in Israeli society right now and enormous divisions. And as you say, people are out protesting on the streets. But no one is executing those protesters. That's what's happening in Gaza. I mean, you are surrounded by autocratic, tyrannical regimes that cannot brook any possible dissent and have this iron fist on their populations, and who have completely expelled all of their Jewish communities, ancient Jewish communities, right? The like societies that are completely Unionine, and who are able to maintain that by being tyrannical regimes, right? That is the autocracies of the Middle East. Like, this is the reason why Israel is in this position, being surrounded by these tyrannical regimes that have to cling to power in any way possible. Like, that is such a baseline fact of the reality of Israel that like people in Israel don't even see it anymore. It's just like it's like talking about air, right? Like, yeah, let's talk about air. You know, there's nitrogen in it, there's oxygen, there's carbon dioxide. Sometimes there's too much carbon dioxide, or carbon monoxide is in the pollutants. It's like you're not even talking about that because that's just like the air you're breathing. Like that's the baseline that you're breathing, and then it's like, well, how are we living within this baseline?
I love that explanation, and I so understand what you're saying. I guess my question is, again, because I haven't been to the States for a long time, actually, since the Pittsburgh shootings, right? That was the last time I was in the States. The language that people use to express themselves and this idea of fighting for justice, it's been so warped in a way in my ears, right? Because I'm not listening to it all day long and understanding exactly all the nuances. And I'm thinking especially about the Jews who have come out against Israel since October 7th in the name of fighting for justice. And so I just wonder if those Jews, these young American Jews, if they see Israel as the homeland of the anti-tyrannical movement that you're describing as well.
I mean, short answer, no. Short answer also, there aren't a lot of those people. I remember seeing a poll in 2024, 85% of Jews in the United States are, what we would call Zionists, basically believe in Jewish right to self-determination in a Jewish state in its ancestral homeland. It's 85% of American Jews under 40. Under 40. So, I mean, yeah, there are some people who, don't agree with this because, two Jews, three opinions, like that's part of this counterculture also. And that's actually one of the other things I have in these modules that I'm teaching about Jewish civilization is the idea of disagreement, right? Of machloket l'shem shamayim, an argument for the sake of heaven is like central to Jewish life. You aren't going to because it's not a tyrannical regime, you aren't going to find this one voice of the Jewish people. You never will. There never was, right? We don't have a pope. We don't have that. But what I often say when I speak to audiences on college campuses, it's like, yes, there are anti-Zionist Jews. In my opinion, that idea comes from a place of enormous privilege. To use the language, of these, of these people in that circle, it comes from a place of enormous privilege, right? You can sit in New Jersey and pontificate about, we should just open up all the borders of Israel and see what happens. Like, yeah, let's see what happens. I'm pretty sure we saw what that happened. What would happen on October 7th when that happened. So yeah, that's something that you can talk about when you're sitting in New Jersey, and you really can't talk about it when you're sitting in State Road. So, there's this, there's this distorted understanding. So one of the things I think about though is that, there's the whole discourse in which this is discussed has been captured essentially by these tyrannical regimes. And when you think about how much of sort of the things that people are seeing online are coming from troll farms in Iran. I mean, I was just at an event at a college a few months ago where I was talking about how I speak to many different audiences, and I do media interviews with many different people, and I talk to people who are left wing, right wing. I talk to everybody, and I did have there's one exception where the one time that I ever turned down an interview like, because I'm like, no, I will not talk to this place, was when I was asked to be interviewed by Mark Lamont Hill on Al Jazeera. And I was like, no, I don't need to participate in this. And I made some joke about this at some college where I was speaking. And one of these students who, yes, was like, basically a white girl in a keffiyeh, came up to me afterwards and was like, you made this joke about Al Jazeera. And I was just curious, like, is Al Jazeera not a legitimate news source? And I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not a legitimate news source on this topic because it's, owned by the Qatari royal family, and they are never going to say anything negative about Hamas. And if you're a news outlet that can never say anything negative about this giant topic that you're covering, then you're really not a news outlet. And she just looked at me and she was like, I had no idea. I repost stuff from them all the time. And I was like, yeah, you and everyone else, right? And so there's just a completely distorted discourse, certainly in English, where, and look, this is true of all social media, right? I mean, people are hearing what, whatever their algorithm is feeding them, right? I mean, that's true in general. And I mean, this is true for people in the Middle East, obviously, also. It's true for people in Israel also. You're seeing what you're being shown. But what I think is interesting is, there's lots of debates that we can have, and you have them on this very podcast all the time about, how, Israel should handle its many, many challenges. The conversation that English-speaking Jews are confronting in the diaspora is not that conversation. It is not a conversation about like, oh, were these, what's the best way to, try to bring home the hostages, right? Should we be negotiating for a ceasefire in order to bring back hostages, or should we be like, those are really essential, vital conversations that everybody needs to be having. That's not what's happening for English-speaking Jewish populations, because that whole discourse is about, should Israel exist? Right? Like, that's what that discourse is about, right? Should Israel exist? Right? Is Israel a racist, settler, colonialist, genocidal, apartheid state? By the way, all of those things are talking points from the KGB. That's the origin of every one of those lines, is from the KGB. So, I mean, like, we're not having the same when say like Jews or Israel and the diaspora are not having the same conversations. Yeah, we're not having the same conversations because in Israel you have the privilege, so to speak, of getting to have an actual conversation about this incredibly difficult situation. And for the most part, that's not what we have the opportunity to discuss in the United States, because there's like 5 Jews, and very few of whom know any other languages other than English, and who don't have a lot of, necessarily, it's like everybody's being fed what the algorithm is feeding them. And what the algorithm is feeding you in a non-Jewish society is all of these assumptions that are so old and do come from this long history of where the baseline assumption is Jews are evil until proven otherwise. And that assumption is so ingrained that people don't even realize that they're thinking it.
So do you think, Dara, that in everything that you've said so far, including all Jews are evil until proven otherwise, that you can just replace the word Israeli at this point too?
I'm not sure I understood your question.
Meaning all Israelis are evil until proven otherwise, that it's just part of the equation, because most Israelis are Jews.
Absolutely. Exactly the same. And to me, this is sort of the consistent through line of anti-Semitism really since ancient times. And to me, it does go back to this dynamic between these, dominant societies and a counterculture, and Judaism as this counterculture that was refusing to conform. It absolutely, anti-Semitism at its root is a lie. And the lie is that Jews are the obstacle to whatever you value most. And Jews are therefore collectively evil and don't deserve to exist, and opposing them is a form of righteousness. So that is absolutely the case, because you see this, and people will use these terms like, oh, it's a double standard, blah, blah, blah. It's not, I wouldn't even use that. It's not even that it's a double standard that's applied to Israelis, because that implies that there's a standard, right? That implies that, you would of course, naturally, speak to anyone from any country and immediately be talking about their country's politics and, their role in it, something like, and you would immediately, boycott all Chinese and Russian academics, and you wouldn't even think about, it's like, no, if that were the case, then like, or we'd be having a debate about that. Like, we're not having a debate about that. We're coming in with the assumption that Jews are evil, right? We're not coming in with the assumption that Arabs are evil, right? That would be racist. That would be racist. And, this is, anti-Jewish racism is totally cool. It's totally fine. So yeah, building on it's and it's amazing to me. It's like, yes, it's about Israelis. It's about all Jews, though. I remember another example I always give about this is there was an article a couple of years ago in the New York Times about, it was an investigation of Hasidic schools in New York City, and public funding and things like this. And it was frankly there were a lot of things in there that were legitimate critique that and I have very similar conversations about Haredi schools in Israel and what are they teaching, and they're taking public funds and blah blah blah. There are a couple paragraphs though in that article that revealed the game, and there was an articles about how it talked about how these Hasidic communities in New York City were manipulating the city through block voting. And the example it gave of this was, they said, part of the way they do this is through the children in the schools. And they talked about how on the day after election day, they would ask all the children in the schools to bring in, a lot of times in the United States, when you go to vote, they give you a sticker after you vote that you wear on your shirt that says, "I voted today," right? The purpose is to, increase voter turnout, remind other people to vote. And that you had to bring in the kids had to bring in their parents' stickers showing that they voted. And they were then rewarding the children whose parents had voted. They, let them go on a field trip to an amusement park, something like that. And in this article, it talked about how, this showed how these Hasidic Jewish communities were manipulating city politics. And I just read that and I thought, if this were an article about any other minority community in New York City, it would have been a celebratory article about how wonderful it is that, Haitian Americans, they managed to crack the problem of voter turnout, right? Like, I'm thinking, like, what's the message here? Like, do we not want people to vote? Right? Like, is the critique here that Jews are good at voting? Right? Like, what are we actually saying here? And then what you realize is, like, wow, there's actually this baseline assumption that if Jews are doing something as a community, it is evil until proven otherwise. And you just realize, like, that assumption is so deep that you don't even realize you're making it. I mean, and it is, of course, all over any kind of conversation with about anything Israel has ever done ever. This sort of goes without saying, and you can trace the history of that. Yeah.
My question for you on this article, and we've been going on for so long, so any listener who's still with us, thank you very much. But my question for you on this particular article from the New York Times is, often the New York Times staff, not always, but an incredible proportion of the New York Times staff is actually Jewish, and much of the editorial staff as well. And you just have to wonder, why didn't it get stopped along the way by the Jews who are on the staff there who are reading it? That's kind of my...
This is what I think people don't understand, is when you're living in this society where those are the assumptions, those are also your assumptions. It takes an enormous amount of education and self-awareness to not have those assumptions. So the fact that you're like, oh, well, I'm Jewish, it's like, and it's like, it's not relevant. Like, you're an English-speaking American who's, you're living in this society where these are the assumptions. Like, it's like fish swimming in water saying what's water. It's like you don't even know that you've imbibed these assumptions. Like, it takes a huge amount of self-awareness. Not even self-awareness. It takes a huge amount of education and knowledge of Jewish life and history to be able to unpack any of that. So, yeah.
So I wish you much success with your educational endeavor, which is called, again, Mosaic what?
Mosaic Persuasion. which is a joke
Mosaic
that 5
Persuasion.
people will get, and that's fine.
I didn't get it, but I'm sure those 5 people are chuckling very loudly right now. Yofi. All right, Dara, thank you so much for spending so much time with me. I really appreciate it today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. This was produced by The Podwaves and edited on video by Thomas Gersh. Until next week, shalom.